As the world heads into 2025, a quarter of the way through the 21st century, the expectation is for plenty of change in the year ahead. Not least here in the United States, where Donald Trump will be returning to the White House. Some see it as a triumphant return for the only man they believe can save America and turn its failures and fortunes around. Others, though, view it with trepidation, believing that the country's position globally will be undermined. Trump and US voters put domestic issues at the top of their priority list, in particular the cost of living. Inflation has dropped dramatically since post-pandemic highs, but Trump says he'll improve the US economy and put more money in people's pockets. He wants to end taxes on tips and social security benefits, cut taxes for corporations and higher earners, but he also wants to expand the child tax credit. He ambitiously wants to slash gas prices by more than $1 and make interest on car loan payments tax deductible. But some economists say that the tax cuts alone will add $4.6 trillion to the US deficit.
He's going to increase our deficit spending, which itself could be inflationary, but for sure it just leads to a bigger mountain of debt that we have to pay interest on. And at some point when he's gone, the country will have to deal with all that debt.
The other big vote winner for Trump was immigration. He's promised the mass deportation of the roughly 11 million illegal immigrants living in the US, declaring a national emergency, mobilizing the military, and ramping up border security has won broad conservative support. But it would drastically reduce the workforce, causing GDP, by some estimates, to shrink by more than $1 trillion. Trump plans to increase oil and gas production and bolster US energy independence. With that, he plans to roll back emissions regulations on cars and power plants and once again pull the US out of the Paris Climate Agreement, all of which is prompting climate concerns at home and abroad.
Where we will see leadership in trying to at least slow down the trajectory we are on in continuing to pollute the atmosphere with carbon from the burning of fossil fuels, causing extreme weather. I doubt that leadership is going to come from the United States. It's going to come from other countries, if anywhere.
On abortion rights, Trump has said he doesn't plan to implement a nationwide ban on abortions, instead leaving it up to states to decide their own policies. But anti-abortion activists fear more restrictions on access to things like abortion medication. Trump wants to target education reform too. He's pledged to scrap the Department of Education, giving states and parents more freedom to decide what children are taught. That would mean more funding to schools and colleges that teach conservative ideas and less funding for those that lean liberal.
The strength of American higher education in part is derived from the fact that it is free from governmental overreach and political intrusion. And what we're seeing now is legislation introduced in red states, and we fear national legislation that will eliminate all diversity, equity, and inclusion programs that serve a wide range of students.
Many of these major changes would need approval from Congress, but with the Republicans controlling both the House and the Senate, Donald Trump will have the power to make the policies he wants, moving the US's domestic agenda firmly to the right, something that the majority of Americans now clearly support. But it's not just issues here at home. His election will cause ripples globally. Remember the saying, when the US sneezes, the whole world catches a cold.
Trump's next administration will indeed affect the world. The US is currently invested in regional wars in the Middle East and between Ukraine and Russia. Trump's policies could amount to a war on trade if he decides to implement tariffs. There may also be a Trump effect on climate change if he rolls back support for climate agreements. But will Trump's America First policies necessarily mean that everyone else is last? I spoke to Matt Duss, former Foreign Policy Director for Bernie Sanders' 2020 presidential campaign and Executive Vice President at the non-profit think tank Centre for International Policy. I started by asking him if Trump's threats of hell on earth, if Israeli hostages are not released by the time he's back in office, are actually going to end the violence.
You never want to discount or downplay that kind of rhetoric, especially with the kind of weaponry and violence that the United States can bring to bear if it chooses, the violence we've already seen Israel bringing to bear on Gaza. But this kind of threat, this kind of bluster from Trump, of course, we saw this a lot in his first term. This is part of his character, his general approach to business, whether it's real estate or whether it's foreign policy. But I do think that, to make this kind of threat, we saw threats toward Canada and Mexico, for example, on tariffs, different situations, but I think his approach is the same, to make these threats and then come away from meetings with the Prime Minister of Canada or the President of Mexico and say, well, I got something, see my threats worked. So I think it's possible we could see some progress toward a ceasefire in Gaza.
How about then moving on to Ukraine? You've written reports before suggesting that now is the time to talk for some form of agreement. We know that Trump has a reputation as being more favourable towards President Putin of Russia. Do you think a deal is possible at this point? And do you think it's inevitable that it would favour Russia more than perhaps Ukraine would want?
Yeah, I think the real variable here is Vladimir Putin. What is Vladimir Putin willing to agree to? Is he interested in having a real negotiation over the future of Ukraine? I think there are, negotiations are good. Obviously, people want peace. A ceasefire would be good. But the question I and I think others have had is, will a ceasefire be durable? Will a peace agreement be durable, or will it simply be a pause for a period of months, or maybe even years, until Vladimir Putin decides once again he's going to go for Kyiv? But if we're looking toward the path of least harm, which is how I tend to approach these questions, if it's possible to get an agreement that helps Ukraine retain its independence, retain to defend itself, I think we need to look very, very seriously at that. Obviously, that's going to be very politically difficult for Ukrainians themselves, who are rightly outraged at the idea of losing parts of their country to the east. However, I do see if this could end the fighting, which has been enormously costly, obviously, for the Ukrainians, destructive for Russians as well, although it's clear that Russia can probably sustain this war for longer than Ukraine can. If we can get an agreement that, deepens ties between Ukraine and Europe, and again, protects Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and self-defense, I think that is something we need to look at very, very seriously. But again, the key question here is Putin interested in such an agreement?
And how about Trump's relations to NATO partners? He's, pushed NATO partners to increase defence spending in the past. He's threatened that he would withdraw support for NATO to an extent. You've got Mark Rutte, the new chief of NATO, saying recently that actually it's a threat to the US from China, North Korea, Iran if things are not resolved well for Ukraine. Do you see Trump as being willing to go that far with regard to NATO?
You don't want to count that out, but I also think it's important to understand his criticism of NATO in the context of his general argument about politics, which is that we are getting ripped off. Whether it's domestically here, this idea that there is an elite political class that is ripping off working people, obviously Trump is very much part of that elite political class, but internationally the United States has been paying too much for allies and partners who are essentially free riders on the United States as their security guarantor.
How about the work that's been done with regard to US Indo-Pacific ties? There's a lot of work that's been done in this administration and previous ones to increase relations, whether it's through AUKUS, Australia, UK, whether it's through the Quad security dialogue, Japan and India. Is that work all to be torn up now? Do you think those will remain?
It's hard to say, but I do think one thing that was shared between the Trump administration into the Biden administration was the prioritization of China. I mean, this is the threat or the strategic competition with China, to use the preferred term in Washington, has become the kind of lens through which all of foreign policy is essentially seen now.
You mentioned China there. Of course, we've heard from Trump these threats of tariffs. And, in particular, he's mentioned really high tariffs on China and recently BRICS countries as a whole. Is this the type of action that Trump is likely to carry forward? And if he does so, what do you see as the consequences?
Yeah, well, I think it's likely he will carry forward if he does not see any kind of action on the part of the countries he's threatening. I mean, he leveled tariffs during his first administration. This was something he broke with years of, alleged foreign policy and economic consensus. And now he has changed that consensus because people see tariffs as yet another economic tool, even though they were seen as, we don't want to use tariffs for many decades. I think the impact could be, because again, the tariffs could be seen essentially as a tax on American consumers. These companies will not pay those costs. Those governments will not pay those costs. Those costs will be added to the price of these goods. So Americans will be the ones who will be forced to pay more. So the question will be, who do they then blame? And I think Trump will be, very happy to displace that blame onto other countries, onto disfavored minorities here in the United States, whether they're immigrants, migrants, or others here. But on foreign policy, the executive branch, the president, has enormous leeway. So there is a great deal that he can do simply by his own. I'm sure he would prefer to have congressional support. He would prefer to certainly have his own party support, which I think he is largely going to have regardless. But again, even if members of Congress look for ways to pump the brakes on what he's trying to do, as I said, the Constitution gives the president enormous authority to carry out foreign policy.
That was Matt Duss, Executive Vice President at the Center for International Policy. Well, Trump's plans for foreign policy are already well underway, but a lot may yet happen before he gets sworn back into the White House on January 20th, 2025, as questions swirl about what his return to power means for US relations with its adversaries and allies.
Times have been tough for 60-year-old Cao Pingjun, hailing from Handan in northern China's Hebei province. He's worked odd jobs in neighboring Beijing for the last 5 years, but work in the Chinese capital has been hard to come by in recent months.
现在挣不上钱，还不如疫情呢。跟你说，疫情那时候活也多，他人都不出来了，还出来就在这干活。你像我们这年龄大的更不行了，这生活没保障。
In 2024, Mr. Cao earned an average $410 per month, half of what he used to make a few years ago.
打工呢就没有休息天儿，跟你说，你干一天就给一天钱。
Others CNA spoke to have echoed this sentiment. Authorities have also noticed and taken action. Since September, a raft of economic stimulus measures was announced to address the weaker-than-expected post-pandemic recovery.
This shifting of the tide, as described by some, came as China marked 4.6% GDP growth in the third quarter of 2024. Now, that also being the second straight quarter in which it missed its annual economic growth target, which was set at around 5%. To address these concerns, authorities have unveiled a whole slew of stimulus measures, ranging from monetary policies to moves to stop the property market from decline and a 12 trillion yuan debt swap program to address high local government debt.
There have been some signs of recovery, like improved retail sales figures in October and more buoyant property and capital markets. But some analysts remain disappointed and urge China to unleash more economic firepower. This especially as the country prepares for a new yet familiar challenge.
If China or some other country is behaving badly, we have things called tariffs that are so severe.
The return of US President-elect Donald Trump to the White House in January is expected to heighten tensions for already difficult Sino-US relations. Mr. Trump has threatened tariffs on all foreign imports, with an additional 60% on Chinese goods. Even though that's just a campaign trail threat for now, government advisors at a recent media briefing signaled that China is ready if Mr. Trump makes good on his promises.
我想这个概率还是比较高啊，但是我们考虑的是，第一，跟特朗普政府加强沟通啊，这个体现我们愿意搞全球大循环啊， 全球都优化这个资源配置，同时有利于各国的税收就业啊。但是特朗普如果执意要打啊，那中国也只能这个既传递我们的信息，同时还要积极的应对。我们国内大循环，要进一步的畅通起来。
Other analysts add this will unlikely be a repeat of the tariff war during Mr. Trump's first term.
The first school of thought says that China is actually in a stronger position than before. Just on trade alone, it has trillions of dollars surplus. The other school of thought says that China is coping with structural challenges, for example, weakness in the property sector, and also consumer spending has dropped. So given these structural changes, China may be in a position that is somewhat more vulnerable than Trade War 1.0.
Another brutal trade war could spell even closer ties with China-friendly countries like Russia. But regardless of the volatility abroad, one thing is certain, that the Chinese leadership would be keen to show a strong front to its domestic audience and ensure much-prized social stability at home.
Japan forged stable ties with Donald Trump during his first term. Then Prime Minister Shinzo Abe was the first foreign leader to meet Mr. Trump when he was president-elect, and they even became Gulf buddies. There were no major trade frictions. In fact, Mr. Trump supported Mr. Abe's concept of a free and open Indo-Pacific. As the 2024 U.S. presidential election approached, the phrase "moshitora," meaning "if Trump returns," emerged. Japan's government began reaching out to Mr. Trump. Former Prime Minister Taro Aso, who was then vice president of Japan's ruling Liberal Democratic Party and a close friend of the late Mr. Abe, met Mr. Trump in New York in April 2024. They confirmed the importance of the Japan-US alliance, according to Mr. Trump's camp. But there are doubts as to whether Japan's new Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba can build on Mr. Abe's legacy and cultivate close ties with Mr. Trump. Mr. Ishiba's ruling party lost its majority in the general election in October 2024, the month he took office. That's in contrast to Mr. Abe, who had a strong mandate, says former Japanese ambassador to the U.S., Ichiro Fujisaki.
The reason Mr. Abe was able to establish good relations with Mr. Trump, President Trump at the time, was because of, if I may say, 3 Ps. The first P is, as you say, personal relations. Second, power. He was strong in his country. He won all the elections, and he had a majority in lower house as well as upper house. Third P is profit. How he could bring profit to the United States.
But Mr. Fujisaki is hopeful Mr. Ishiba, a former defense minister, can strengthen the Japan-US security alliance.
In order for the United States to have some influence in this region, U.S. presence here is important too. The military presence, I mean. I think Ishiba-san knows defense issues, diplomatic issues very well, so I think he could convince Mr. Trump.
Japan laid out plans for a defense buildup worth 43 trillion yen, or about $300 billion over 5 years, back in 2022. The increase in spending sought to strengthen Japan's missile and standoff defense capabilities, an effort Mr. Trump has praised, though it's unclear if he will be satisfied with this. In his first term, he had demanded that Japan pay more to host U.S. troops stationed there, who number about 54,000. On trade, it's not certain yet if Mr. Trump will impose tariffs on imports from allies, including Japan. Mr. Fujisaki says Japan will have to convince him that there is no reason to do so.
We are not really hurting their economy at all. We are number one investor, creating jobs in the United States. We have to explain these positions to himself and to his officials.
Another sticking point between Japan and the U.S. is Nippon Steel's proposal to acquire U.S. Steel for $14 billion, which both the Biden administration and Mr. Trump oppose. Japan's largest business organization, Keidanren, together with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, expressed concern over political interference in business deals in a letter to U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen. Posting on social media in early December, Mr. Trump reiterated his objection to the acquisition, adding that he will block the deal as president. 6 in 10 Japanese believe a Trump presidency will have a negative impact on Japan, according to a survey conducted by public broadcaster NHK in November. It remains to be seen how the Japan-US alliance could evolve as the president-elect takes the helm.
South Korea was plunged into political turmoil after its president's short-lived attempt to declare martial law on the 9th of December 3rd stunned the nation and its allies. Tens of thousands of protesters took to the streets demanding the resignation of Yoon Suk-yeol. The fallout has rattled South Korea's economy, Asia's 4th largest, and cast doubt over its stability. Foreign leaders scrapped meetings and planned visits, including U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin. The U.S. has stressed the importance of its security alliance with Seoul, a key Washington ally in the region. But the current crisis adds a layer of uncertainty to bilateral ties, as the U.S. too is heading into a period of transition. Many of the signs are in English here on the street in Pyeongtaek, about an hour's drive south of South Korea's capital, Seoul. That's because they cater to American soldiers and personnel working at the nearby U.S. Camp Humphreys military base. Camp Humphreys officially opened in 2018 and is now home to more than 40,000 American personnel and their families, with some 28,500 U.S. troops stationed across South Korea. Most of the troops from other bases in South Korea were moved here as agreed between Seoul and Washington in 2004. But Donald Trump has some shop owners worried. He had previously threatened to reduce or even pull out American troops from the country, which would be a blow to business.
오랜 기간 동안 한미 동맹이 오랫동안 지속됐기 때문에 큰 변화는 없을 거로 이렇게 보고 있습니다. 하지만 약간 좀 걱정 반, 우려 반도 좀 없지 않아 있습니다.
South Korea already signed a cost-sharing deal with the U.S. for the upkeep of American forces stationed in the country in 2024. Both sides agreed South Korea would pay about $1.1 billion in 2026, the first year of the 5-year deal, and that annual increases will be capped at 5% per year. The agreement runs until 2030, beyond the 4-year term of the next U.S. president. But many observers in South Korea are certain Mr. Trump would seek renegotiation. For many South Koreans these days, another concern is North Korea's deployment of troops to Russia for the Ukraine war. Tu Jin-ho, chair of the Global Strategy Division at the Korea Institute for Defense Analysis, recently told foreign media he believes sending North Korean troops to Russia could be a big gamble for leader Kim Jong-un, but that it could pay off, especially when he meets Trump, which Mr. Du says is very possible.
위상이 다르죠. 그리고 파병이라는 카드를 사용함으로써 전략적 지위가 상당 부분 상승을 했습니다. 러시아 동급은 아니지만 그래도 어쨌든 러시아의 적절한 카운터 파트가 되었기 때문에 그런 효과들로 인해서 미국하고 또 대화할 수 있는 그 공간이 지금 열리고 있는 것이거든요.
Mr. Tu says it's important that South Korea prepares itself for changes when Mr. Trump takes office in 2025 and study ways it can benefit from those changes.
방위비 협상 협정 분담비 이것도 재협상을 요구할 가능성이 크다라는 겁니다. 그러면 확실한 확정 억제를 담보를 받고 그래서 완벽한 대북 억제를 확립하고 나아가서 주변국의 잠재적인 위협까지도 억제력을 줄 수 있는.
And so it remains to be seen if the U.S.-South Korean alliance, which goes back more than 70 years, will be able to stay strong as it did under the Biden administration. Opinions are mixed in South Korea. While some see Mr. Trump as a threat to the alliance, there are many who say his presidency could bring about unexpected opportunities for bilateral ties and also inter-Korean ties, which remained at a stalemate throughout the Biden administration. But experts warn that South Koreans could demand for more self-reliance when it comes to the country's defense, including by acquiring nuclear weapons if its alliance with the U.S. weakens and concerns over conflict with North Korea grow.
Kami siap melanjutkan estafet kepimpinan. Kita siap bekerja keras menuju Indonesia Emas, menjadi bangsa yang kuat, merdeka, berdaulat, adil dan makmur. Kita tidak mau mengganggu siapapun, kita tidak mau mengganggu bangsa lain, tapi kita juga tidak akan mengizinkan bangsa manapun untuk mengganggu kita.
20th October 2024. The official start of Indonesia's post-Jokowi era, marked by the inauguration of Prabowo Subianto and Gibran Rakabuming Raka as the 8th president and vice president of Southeast Asia's largest economy. In the aftermath of his inauguration, the post-Jokowi changes have been swift. The new president has sworn in the country's largest cabinet since 1966, with 109 members representing his pledge for a strong government. In contrast, his predecessor had 34 ministers and head of government agencies. There are concerns that a fat cabinet may bloat bureaucracy moving forward, and come 2025, analysts say people will look to the cabinet to uphold their pledges.
Cukup besar pemerintahannya, lebih dari 40 kementerian, dan itu dilakukan untuk mengakomodir kepentingan para anggota-anggota partai di koalisi pemerintahan Prabowo Gibran, dan juga memberikan akomodasi kepada aktor-aktor non-negara atau non-partai ya. Di tahun 2025, saya kira publik mulai akan menunggu dan menagih janji politik yang besar dari pemerintahan baru, terutama pada program-program yang memang sejak awal itu selalu menjadi pesan utama dari pemerintahan baru.
The Prabowo Gibran administration has set out 8 goals in their Astacita mission to realize their vision of a golden era of Indonesia. These include self-sufficiency in food, water, and energy, strengthening human resource development, downstreaming and industrialization, and fighting corruption and drugs, among others. As part of materializing these goals, a nationwide free nutritious meal program is planned to start on January 2nd in 2025, with Vice President Gibran Rakabuming Raka conducting checks on the ground at schools prior to the program's launch. There's also a commitment to eradicate extreme poverty within the first 2 years of their term, and a directive for an 8% economic growth target, which some observers have called unrealistic, given the current state of the Indonesian economy.
The most worrying one was the signal of the shrinking of the middle class, which means that it will create a need for a better safety net for more and more people, right? Better safety nets for more and more people means more social programs. Social assistance, direct cash transfers, and so on and so forth. This will consume more of the national budget.
Then, a question mark on the progress of Indonesia's new capital, Nusantara. Throughout campaigning, President Prabowo pledged to continue its construction. But Nusantara was not mentioned in Mr. Prabowo's inauguration speech. And Minister of Public Works Dodi Hanggodo has said that his party would likely stop major construction projects due to budget constraints, making clear that while construction of the new capital will continue, it will not be at the same pace as before. The Ministry of Public Works and Housing, while still under former President Widodo, received a budget ceiling for the 2025 budget year of over $7 billion. Minister Dodi has said that of the total budget, only around 4% can be used by the ministry for new projects, but that he is still waiting for direction from President Prabowo. Prior to winning the presidency, Prabowo Subianto has long earned a reputation as a military strongman. one who is firm and deeply nationalistic. Having personally met global leaders even before his presidential inauguration and engaged with diverse partners in Asia and Europe to shore up Indonesia's positions in trade, defense, security, and other areas, President Prabowo has secured over $18 billion in investment commitments since winning the vote. With China as his first stop, followed by the US in his first overseas tour, the new president has actively shown that he is planning on having a more hands-on approach in dealing with foreign policy matters than his predecessor.
1,000 friends are too few while one enemy is too many. That's what Indonesian President Prabowo Subianto has always said. According to analysts, while former President Joko Widodo and current President Prabowo Subianto are different in their methods, at their roots is a pragmatic approach to reap the benefits of foreign investment. That means that all eyes are on Indonesia and its new leader in anticipation of a promising future.
It's a normal Tuesday morning at Government House in Bangkok. The ministers arrive for the weekly cabinet meeting, followed by Prime Minister Paetongtarn Shinawatra. It's a demonstration of normalcy, business as usual. But Thai politics is rarely normal, and the origin of this government is anything but.
Thailand's largest opposition party, Move Forward, has been dissolved.
Well, that is definitely a negative outcome, a negative sign of Thai politics in general.
Constitutional Court finding Prime Minister Srettha Thavisin guilty of an ethics violation and removing him from office.
He's the fourth Thai premier in 16 years to be removed in verdicts by the same court.
Thaksin Shinawatra has summoned the leader of all coalition parties to his home for an urgent meeting to talk about what to do next.
Thai lawmakers have elected the country's youngest prime minister. She is 37-year-old Paetongtarn Shinawatra, the daughter of the ousted ex-leader Thaksin.
Within a span of 72 hours, Thailand has changed prime ministers. And for the first time in a decade, another Shinawatra family member is taking the helm of the Thai government again. Ms. Paetongtarn is the country's youngest ever leader and also the second female prime minister, stepping in the footsteps of her aunt Yingluck, who, like her father and ex-premier Thaksin, was ousted in the military coup. It's perhaps ironic that now she's leading a coalition of frenemies consisting of past rivals of the governing Pheu Thai party and its patriarch, none other than her father Thaksin.
ในภาวะของการเป็นรัฐบาลผสมก็ไม่ได้เป็นโจทย์ที่ง่ายนะครับสำหรับพรรคเพื่อไทยเลยนะซึ่งตรงนี้ต่างกับในอดีตนะครับที่พรรคเพื่อไทยเองนั้นเนี่ยเรียกว่าข้อจำกัดทางการบริหารน้อยกว่าในปัจจุบันครับนะเพราะว่าในสมัยของการเป็นพรรคไทยรักไทยก็ดีพรรคพลังประชาชนก็ดีหรือว่าเพื่อไทยในก่อนหน้านี้ก็ดีนะครับการมีเสียงข้างมากที่เด็ดขาดในสภาเนี่ยทำให้การตัดสินใจการบริหารงานต่างๆในรัฐบาลก็ทำได้โดยง่ายแต่วันนี้พอไม่มีเสียงข้างมากที่เด็ดขาดเราจะเห็นได้ว่าหลายๆนโยบายต้องอาศัยการต่อรองอาศัยการพูดคุย
The previous government of Srettha Thavisin focused on quick wins, such as reviving tourism arrivals to almost pre-pandemic records and trying to lure foreign investment to Thailand in order to boost Thailand's slow-growing economy, a priority that Ms. Paetongtarn will continue in her government. On the to-do list, there's still some unfulfilled campaign promises. There is, for instance, the digital wallet cash handout policy. Sure, some Thais have already gotten their 10,000 baht or almost $300, but the majority of the 50 million eligible Thais, they're still waiting for their money. It is going to cost the government a total of $13 billion in an effort to boost consumption. It's expected to come sometime in 2025, which is a lot later than initially announced. Then there's the issue of household debt, which is weighing heavily on the Thai economy, almost 90% to the GDP. Having said that, there are already some measures on the way, such as the suspension of interest and the delayment of principal payment. So all in all, measures aimed to ease the burden to the people so they're not defaulting on their loans or credits. And then there are also some proposed political reforms, such as proposed amendments to the 2017 constitution. But it has turned out to be more laborious than they have hoped for, and every consensus with the other parties is a hard-fought one. there are some doubts whether or not we will get a new constitution before the next elections sometime in 2027. But Thai politics operates in at least two worlds, in the halls of powers in Bangkok and outside the capital in the rest of Thailand. For the local elections in northeastern Udon Thani, the Pheu Thai party is bringing the big guns. Thaksin Shinawatra is back on the campaign trail for the first time after returning from 15 years of self-exile and a brief hospital detention. Despite his 75 years, being back at the front lines of politics appears to have rejuvenated his spirits. Thaksin is tying his political legacy to his daughter's political success, but his personal investment in politics is seen by critics as meddling and could embolden his enemies to move against him and destabilize his daughter's government and Thai democracy as a whole. Back in Bangkok, where Prime Minister Paetongtarn is touting her first 90 days in office, promising a raft of policies for the next year that she believes are a real possibility to change Thailand for the better.
เพราะฉะนั้นนะคะในวันนี้ค่ะก็ขอเชิญชวนทุกท่านนะคะมาร่วมกันในทุกภาคส่วนนะคะทำเพื่อประเทศไทยที่เรารักทำเพื่อประชาชนคนไทยที่เรารักวางทางที่เข้มแข็งไว้กับให้ลูกหลานเราในอนาคตอีก10 ปี20 ปีเราได้สร้างรากฐานที่มั่นคงให้กับประเทศไทยนี้ไว้แล้วในวันที่เรามีโอกาสมีหน้าที่มีตำแหน่งในการดูแลพี่น้องประชาชนเพราะฉะนั้นก็มาร่วมกันค่ะทำวันนี้เพื่อพี่น้องประชาชนคนไทยของเราทุกคนอย่างดีที่สุดค่ะ
A few months is a short time frame to measure success, but Thai politics rarely sails through calm waters, and the path ahead is murky. A steady hand or two are needed to prevent this government from running ashore.
In geopolitics, friendship and alliances are crucial. Countries that share similar interests often form alliances and groupings to their mutual benefit, creating an interdependent ecosystem. There are numerous groupings. There's the European Union, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in Europe and North America, the Gulf Cooperation Council in the Middle East, and in Asia, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. ASEAN was founded in 1967. It currently has 10 member countries. Multilateralism is the cornerstone of ASEAN's diplomacy, meaning when it comes to negotiating or meeting other groupings or major powers, it chooses to do it as a bloc, as ASEAN. But ASEAN's preference for multilateral engagements is increasingly challenged by the rise of minilateralism. The evolution of the Quad, a security partnership among Australia, India, Japan and the US, and the establishment of AUKUS, a trilateral pact between Australia, the UK and the US, have sparked debates about the rise and role of minilateralism in this region's architecture. Amid deepening major power rivalry and the shortcomings of large-scale multilateralism, minilateralism is emerging as an alternative.
So how will this affect the dynamics of ASEAN and its relevance? For more, I'll be speaking with 3 geopolitical experts, starting with Dr. Alan Chong. Dr. Chong, explain to our viewers why multilateralism is so important to ASEAN.
So multilateralism is a diplomatic strategy. Not all states come to a multilateral gathering with the noblest of intentions. Some states strategize to hide behind multilateralism, meaning I do not want to put resources. So multilateralism can be a way for some states to free ride.
At the same time, ASEAN needs to deal with the rise of minilateralism.
ASEAN is really no stranger to minilaterals. I guess the concern here is that the emergence of minilaterals where ASEAN has no stake in, and a lot of these minilaterals are by ASEAN dialogue partners, or they just might feel that their interests are not being adequately met.
For thorny issues like the South China Sea, ASEAN seeks to address it through multilateral channels.
And it's not realistic to expect all ASEAN member states to share similar priorities, similar concerns. Do maritime Southeast Asia states or claimant states in Southeast Asia and the South China Sea, do we realistically expect landlocked countries in Southeast Asia or countries that front the Indian Ocean to share a similar degree of concern that those of us who are claimants are? Similarly, do countries in mainland Southeast Asia who are in the lower Mekong region, who suffer their own challenges because of Chinese damming and control of water in the upper Mekong, do they get the kind of support that they feel that they ought to get?
Now let's switch gears now and talk about how all these mini groupings may impact ASEAN's economy with our next guest. Roland?
AUKUS has internal cooperation on technology amongst their group, but really then they're not really doing much externally orientated. Quad is doing some things. It has some initiatives in terms of combating illegal fishing, cybersecurity, infrastructure, health, these sorts of areas, but they're still quite small scale at the end of the day. So really the reality is that these minilateral arrangements like Quad, at this point, they don't have a big bearing on the region's economies.
Recently, several ASEAN members have been exploring new trade opportunities. 4 ASEAN member states have now partnered with BRICS, a grouping that includes China, Russia and India, among other countries.
BRICS doesn't really do much. They've positioned themselves as kind of like a voice for discontent with the way things are under a US-led, Western-led global economic order in particular. The closest thing they've come to it would be, they set up a BRICS bank, which has some funding attached to it. But the reality is that is about avoiding sanctions rather than creating new, avoiding US sanctions through the US dollar system, rather than creating new economic opportunities. It's a long way off anyway to establish that kind of system. But when it comes to trade, there's just not much on the table for ASEAN or other countries.
Some observers believe that certain ASEAN members like Malaysia join BRICS to diversify their economic interests. But with no tangible benefits from the grouping so far, others argue that this move reflects an effort to expand global partnership and reduce dependence on the West amid escalating global tensions.
Taking over ASEAN chairmanship for 2025 is Malaysia. It's been one of the biggest beneficiaries of the China Plus One strategy as companies diversify their businesses to alternative destinations beyond China. The existing ecosystem, abundance of resources, and relatively skilled workforce put Malaysia in a sweet spot. In particular, the semiconductor and data center industries have attracted billions of investments from Europe, the US, and China.
Today, I offer our nation as the most neutral and non-aligned location for semiconductor production to help build a more secure and resilient global semiconductor supply chain.
As host for ASEAN, Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim has big plans for the Southeast Asian grouping. Malaysia is recognized as the 6th largest exporter of semiconductors and currently has 13% of the testing and packaging market. It's eager to move up the value chain and venture into front-end advanced packaging and testing, including integrated circuit design. And ASEAN, with a combined population of more than 670 million and a growing middle class, not only represents a ready market, but also has the potential to develop its own supply chain for the important semiconductor industry. But it's a challenge to galvanize 10 member nations to come together and collaborate effectively.
It's not going to be easy. Our country is more developed than others, and we have a very diverse economic structure, economic development, and diverse industry groupings within ASEAN nations.
While actively expanding intra-ASEAN trade, it currently accounts for 22.9% of total exports. Prime Minister Anwar is also seeking to penetrate new markets through engagement with BRICS member countries from Africa to South America, as well as the Middle East. Malaysia will be hosting the inaugural ASEAN Gulf Cooperation Council or GCC summit in May 2025. It's also roping in China, its largest trading partner, for these meetings amid growing perception that Kuala Lumpur is leaning towards Beijing. Prime Minister Anwar has already made 3 trips to China since he assumed office 2 years ago.
And I don't think he's taking sides. In some ways, he's actively hedging, but a little bit more towards China. It's interesting to observe, though, of course, because I think the biggest investor in Malaysia is still the United States. But then I guess he's looking to China to top that up. But it doesn't necessarily pay instant dividends. We'll see how that policy works out.
Mr. Anwar has also reached out to Russian President Vladimir Putin and personally invited him to attend ASEAN meetings together with over a dozen dialogue partners.
That may send the wrong signal to perhaps the United States and maybe some of the European Union member countries. Some of them may be less willing to come to Malaysia for the ASEAN dialogues as a result.
While it's uncertain whether the second Trump administration will impose more import tariffs on similar scale and scope as his campaign rhetoric, many ASEAN countries such as Malaysia, Vietnam and Thailand, which have substantial trade surpluses with the US, are cautiously optimistic.
So look, we're treading through a minefield. That's the bad thing. The good thing is that every country is treading through the same minefield. We just hope the bombs don't go off.
Prime Minister Anwar will have his work cut out to continue striking a delicate balance between US and China in order to stop Malaysia and ASEAN from being caught in a crossfire.